So here in this slide, we see the blood levels of melatonin and cortisol tracked over a overlapping 24-hour period of time. And as you can see, the red line is melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that's produced by the pineal gland of the brain, and it has a very sedative-like effect on the brain. While cortisol, depicted by the black line, is a steroid hormone produced by the adrenal cortex, and it has many functions in the body, including enhancing mental sharpness and alertness. So in lots of ways, melatonin is the sleep hormone, and cortisol is one of our waking hormones. So as you can see, the levels of melatonin begin to rise after about 6 p.m., and that rise facilitates the onset of sleep. Melatonin continues to rise, and it peaks around the midpoint of sleep, and then it begins to fall, and its lowest levels occur just before waking. Now, what we see with cortisol is the opposite pattern. The levels of cortisol begin to rise a few hours before waking. They continue to rise after waking, and then they reach their peak not too long after waking, and then start to fall throughout the day. Okay? So the rise in cortisol, right, this rise in cortisol just before waking actually is helping the onset of waking. Okay? So the onset of sleep is facilitated by both the rise in melatonin and the fall in cortisol. And the process of waking and the rise in alertness is facilitated by the fall in melatonin and the rise in cortisol. So the normal patterns of these two key hormones really help facilitate the sleep-wake cycle, the onset of sleep followed by the onset of waking. It's worth noting, though, that while these hormone patterns clearly play an important role in this sleep-wake cycle, which is controlled by our circadian clock, it's important to note, though, that the normal pattern of release for these hormones are also sleep dependent. That means that a regular sleep pattern helps to promote this optimal pattern of hormone release, which in turn then supports regular sleep. And by regular sleep, I mean having predictable times that you go to sleep and a predictable time that you wake up. And that means that the opposite is true if you have an irregular sleep pattern. So if you do something as common as stay up late 1 to 2 times per week or sleep in on the weekends, that irregular sleep pattern disrupts this hormonal pattern. And a disrupted hormone pattern really fails to properly assist in the generation of a smooth onset of sleep and a smooth onset of waking. So animals, including humans, we all need sleep to survive. In fact, a complete disruption of sleep for a prolonged period of time has actually shown to cause death in laboratory animals. So it's really critical. And not getting an adequate amount of sleep, which we also sometimes call sleep deprivation, has lots of negative effects on the body and can cause illness and impair recovery from illness. Now, sleep deprivation can involve either an acute total sleep deprivation, or it can also involve a chronic partial sleep restriction. Now, whether you're talking about an acute total sleep deprivation, so a short amount of time where you're not sleeping at all, or a chronic partial sleep restriction, where over a much longer period of time you have this restricted or inadequate amount of sleep or quality of sleep, the effects of this kind of sleep deprivation are all very similar. The effects can include significant changes in brain activity, which include things like irritability, cognitive impairment, memory losses, impaired judgment, actual hallucinations, and even symptoms that are similar to ADHD. So, a dysregulation of attention. Sleep impairment can also impair immune function, which leaves the person very vulnerable to infection. It also can delay illness recovery, and it can actually cause illness. Some studies have also shown that chronic sleep restriction increases the risk for the development of type 2 diabetes. Also, sleep deprivation impairs, along with impairing nervous system function, impairs autonomic function. And that can interfere with the normal control of the heart and increase the risk of heart disease. Okay. You also see impaired motor function. So voluntary control of muscles changes. So you see people's reaction times getting increased, so slower reaction times, decreased accuracy, pains and aches, and actual tremors. And then you can also see growth suppression in children. And in people of all ages, you see impaired metabolism, which can cause a decrease in body temperature and a risk for obesity. Now, sleep deprivation, with all of its negative effects, can either be voluntary, where we are choosing to sleep less, or it can be caused by disturbances in sleep, like insomnia, sleep apnea, or a really wide variety of sleep disorders. So we can see that there's this critical link between sleep, rest, and health of the body. And as clinicians caring for patients with illnesses, part of our care should be to teach about and promote good quality and quantity of sleep. Unfortunately, for our ill patients, particularly those cared for in a hospital setting, there are lots of obstacles to getting an adequate amount of sleep. And these obstacles can include patient or illness-related obstacles to sleep, and also, much more commonly, organizational or care-related obstacles to sleep. So the patient and illness-related obstacles include what you might imagine. So symptoms of disease that interfere with sleep, like pain and nausea. Patients are often on drugs that can disturb sleep or actually induce significant insomnia. And many diseases can actually disrupt, part of the process of the disease actually disrupts the quality and or quantity of sleep. But even in the absence of any of those patient or illness-related obstacles, there are some very real organizational or care-related obstacles, particularly in a hospital setting. So we see lots of artificial light sources in a hospital setting that makes it very difficult to control the cues that bring on the onset of sleep. We also see lots of disruptive noises like alarms on monitoring equipment, even as simple as the alarms on IV lines. And also our care model in a hospital setting is a 24-hour-a-day model. So there is no period of time where we stop caring for and stop interacting with our patients in the hospital, which means that they don't really get these really clear cues that this is waking time and this is sleeping time. And then in the process of caring for patients, there are lots of different care providers. Care is very highly specialized between the nursing staff and the nurses' aides and the phlebotomists and the physicians and any number of other specialty providers. And we're all providing pieces of the overall care round the clock, which means that patients get interrupted multiple times a day and also multiple times a night, which ends up interrupting their sleep. Now, if you're interested in reading more about this experience of disrupted sleep in a hospital among hospital patients, and also read about some solutions that are possible, it's this article, this 2013 article from The Atlantic, is worth a read, called "Sleep Deprivation in Hospitals is a Real Problem." And it's written from the perspective of a patient. And this patient also happens to be a behavioral economist. So his insights, he has lots of insights on how problems like this come about and how they can be addressed from an organizational standpoint. And it's really very interesting. He describes that he never went a night. He never went more than an hour over a night without getting some kind of interruption and not being able to sleep. So it's a very, very well written article with a very interesting perspective.